Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to the Secret Resume podcast, hosted by me, Melody Moore. In this podcast, we explore the people, places, and experiences that have shaped my guests, those which have influenced who they are as people and where they are in their work life today. You can listen in as we have a rich exploration of often unexamined and undiscussed, but very important aspects of their lives, or as I like to call it, their secret resume. So, hi everybody, really excited to be here today for this podcast because it's a bit of a different one. The roles are going to be reversed, and I thought because I'm doing the author series I think we've got 6 or 7 different people that I'm interviewing. I thought it might be interesting to be interviewed myself because I am also an author now, which feels very strange to call myself that. And I've asked my very dear friend Jen Kidby to interview me. So she's going to be me today and I'm going to be a guest. So Jen, do you want to say hello?
Thank you, Mel, and hello, everybody. I'm so excited to be here, to be in this seat with you, Mel, in the other seat. And we've known each other for some time. And I was thinking about this conversation and thinking, I wonder what I will learn that I don't already know about you. So I'm kind of a bit intrigued. I'm a tiny bit about me first, just for everybody listening. So I've worked for just over 25 years now in various roles to help organizations be places where people can thrive. I've worked within organizations, I've worked as a consultant, I've done some private practice work, all in the space of coaching and leadership development, team development, people and culture strategy, and organization development. So it's been a real ride. I've had some brilliant roles. And 2016, I took a secondment in Toronto, in Canada, which is where I live now with my husband, daughter, and 2 cats. And that was supposed to be a 2-year secondment, and fell in love with Canada so much that made it a permanent move. So that's where I am today. And Mel, we were chatting the other day. We met 2002, I think. 2002. And I still remember it was my first day working at an organization in Oxford that both Mel and I worked for. We went out for lunch together in Summertown in Oxford, and it's that beautiful thing of finding in a colleague something so special that a beautiful friendship comes from it. And we've been in touch ever since. So thank you for inviting me to be here. And I want to ask you, how does it feel sitting in the other chair today?
I'm slightly nervous.
Yeah.
I maybe now have more empathy for my guests, but actually really excited as well. I've found that people always tell me how much they enjoy doing the podcast, how they enjoy looking back over their lives and their careers in a different way to what they normally do. So I'm really looking forward to doing that for myself. And you were the only person I thought of to interview me. So it's a good job you said yes, really.
When I saw your WhatsApp message, I was so excited. I had that. This is going to be fun. Thank you. So I guess like you do with all of your guests, you go way back to an early stage of their journey. So my first question for you is, when you go back to your early life, what are some of the things that shaped you?
Yeah, it's really interesting just because I happen to have just been with my family, so it kind of reminds me, because we're recording this just after Christmas, and so I've been up north with my family. But the thing that probably stands out more than anything is the fact that I'm the oldest sister. I'm not the oldest child. I'm just the oldest sister. So I have a brother who's 18 months older than me. But I think then I have 2 sisters who are 7 and 8 years younger than me. So I went from being the youngest child to being one of the oldest children, if that makes sense. But with that came, and I'm sure lots of people who are from large families will identify with this, there was a lot of responsibility came with that. And I think particularly being the oldest girl, and we're talking the 70s now, it was a sexist time, more so I think than it is now. And therefore, as the oldest girl, there was quite a lot of responsibility put on me, particularly in terms of looking after my sisters. And I think that has, I think there's two elements. One is the responsibility and feeling responsible for other people. And a kind of, I've always felt, I often feel like a big sister to people, or motherly, I think now, also being a mother, but that kind of is how I've often felt towards other people. But I've just felt a very strong sense of responsibility, that things are my responsibility. I can't say no because I feel very responsible. And I think the other thing that stands out is being part of a big family. You have to just fit in with what the family wants. So your needs, individual needs, kind of are outweighed by the collective need. And that's something that's really played out in my life as well, is not always knowing what my needs are, and certainly in certain circumstances finding it very hard to articulate them, which I know many people find surprising about me, because that's not how I come across. But certainly in personal relationships, I've always found it very difficult to articulate needs. I think when the stakes are high, then that's always been quite difficult.
Well, when did you first become aware that dynamic from your family, from being the oldest sister, when did you first become aware that was shaping you and had shaped you?
I think to some degree, when we did our coaching course,
Mm.
which we did was like 2004-ish,
Oh, yeah. Oh,
five,
yeah.
something like that. That was quite deep. We used to call them our soul dredging weekends. Do you remember?
Gosh, I do. Soul dredging. It was though, right? It was really, really deeply personal.
Yeah, yeah. And so I think that my interest in personal development really kicked off then. And I think, understanding myself started at that point. I had some therapy after that to kind of understand myself
Mhm.
better, but I would say that was when it first started. And
Mm.
then we'll come on to this, but the course that I'm doing now has really, really helped me
Yeah,
understand myself so much better.
yeah. And just going back to that childhood phase of your life when you were the oldest sister, that sense of responsibility, how did that show up then at that early age?
I think looking after my sisters a lot. So literally childcare. But even
Mm.
as a student, I went to York University, which was a couple of hours away from where I lived, and my sisters would come and stay with me. In their holidays, they would come over, and that's quite unusual, I think, for most students to be looking after kids that were maybe 10 or 11 at the time. Um, so yeah, it and it didn't. What was interesting is it didn't feel like a burden. It just felt natural that was how it was, and I guess it's part of what always led into me thinking I'd always want children. Is that I enjoyed looking after my sisters, and I've continued to play a part in their lives as we've all grown.
I find it so fascinating listening to you talk about your family. And just before we started recording, we were chatting about Christmas. And Mel, I think you said it was a quiet Christmas. There were just
10 or 11
10
of
of
us,
you.
yeah.
And I'm an only child, and moving here to Canada, I said, well, our Christmas was three of us and two cats, which is really quiet. So I always find it fascinating that all those dynamics and everything you learn through those dynamics that carries through with you. Are there any particular memories that stand out from that time and that phase of your life?
I think the times that stand out the most are going on holiday, actually.
Mm.
My dad was a teacher, and so we would quite often go camping. As very many British children of who had parents were teachers will recognise this. We went camping in France. That's what everybody did. Not until we were older. Not until I was older. Not until probably, well after my sisters were born. But then it became a regular thing that we would go. And we'd have these terrible drives. 4 kids in a car. It was a nightmare. And
sounds like a sitcom.
Like the good life, not the good life. It was so it was great fun, because once we got there, it was horrible before we got there. Everyone fighting in the car, and my dad getting really stressed. Obviously pre-sat nav, they'd be trying to read these maps, French maps. Terrible, absolutely terrible. But what I remember there was the freedom of being able to, I grew up in the countryside, so it was very free, certainly much more free than kids these days, and certainly much more free than my daughter is. But we would go out all day and disappear, and my friends had a farm, and we'd go up to the farm and hang out, and it was a very, no mobile phones. Parents obviously didn't know where we were, and that was equally true when we went on holiday as at home. But I remember my childhood being quite free in that sense of you'd just disappear off and come back. And it's such a cliche to talk about that, but it was genuinely true. So I remember that kind of it's like no responsibilities, but then the responsibilities of my sisters. I
was just hearing that, almost that paradox of freedom and responsibility.
And
both sound like they were present in your life.
And the other thing I remember randomly is when I went to secondary school, a lot of my friends lived in maybe 5 miles or so away from me. So especially as I got older, there was a sense of I saw my friends at school, but there was quite often things would be going on and I wasn't there because I lived 5 or so miles away. And I think in some ways that was a good thing, because it probably made me study more than I would have done if I got distracted. But I have a slight sense of sort of isolation from that, as well as not being around when some of the fun stuff was going on.
That must have been that. I know nowadays in organizations we talk a lot about belonging and sense of belonging and inclusion. That sounds like it could have been quite challenging for you at the time. Is that what it was like?
Yes and no, I would say. I don't feel like I was. I definitely had a gang of friends. I was definitely part of the group, but at times the group were doing things and I wasn't. So yes, not most of the time, but sometimes. I didn't feel kind of other or isolated. Just more the physical location meant that I didn't always get to join in.
And then thinking about that earlier time in your life, who around you were your inspirations, your role models?
It's a really interesting one, role models, isn't it? Because people often have very clear answers around role models, and really there's only one person that comes to mind for me. Someone asked the other day about who did I admire and want to be like, and I don't have that kind of aspiration often, but I did. And it's only really, I think, reflecting on it that I realised this. I don't think I realised at the time, but I had a godmother called Ruth, who I am named after. We are both Ruths as middle names, aren't we?
We are both Ruth. I was named after a donkey called Ruth, though. So yours has far more meaning.
Yeah, exactly. No animals involved in the naming of my middle name. But my Auntie Ruth, we called her Auntie Ruth. In those days, everyone was an auntie, whether they were an auntie or not.
Well, aren't they? Aunties and uncles, your next door neighbours, your auntie and uncle.
Yeah, your mum, your parents' friends, they were aunties and uncles. Your friends' parents were aunties and uncles. Anyway, I don't know if that's still the case. Don't think so. But Auntie Ruth was my grandmother's cousin. So she was the same age as my grandma. But she was my godmother. And I think part of the reason that she was my godmother is I think she lost a child around the time that I was born, I think. Or maybe before that, but I think that's partly why she became my godmother and I was called Ruth.
That and that sort of thing wasn't always talked about back
No,
then at all, was it? Even
no.
if you saying now, I think this is
Yeah,
happened.
yeah. And they never had children, her and her husband. But they had lots of nieces and nephews who they were very close to, and I was one of them. But Ruth was, so in my family and where I grew up, so I grew up in the Lake District, rural, tourist area. I didn't really know women who had professional jobs. I and I, I'm always really interested in this idea, particularly of social mobility and what you learn from, your environment. And, I didn't have people who I could look at and think, oh, yeah, I want to be like her. In fact, I didn't really know anybody particularly, other than my uncle was a lawyer, but they didn't live close to us, who had a professional job. It wasn't everybody who I knew, their parents were farmers or teachers. We were surrounded by teachers because of my dad. Even my mum had trained as a teacher but didn't teach. So she was someone who she'd gone off to Africa and taught in Africa. I don't even know when it was. It must have been like the 40s or something. Like it was really
By a woman by
unusual.
herself.
Yeah,
Wow.
yes. And she had a really nice house and lots, and particularly as I got older and became a student, and they were down in Bristol, and I'd go and visit them on my own without the family. Previous to that, it'd always been with the family. And, I've just really got on with her and her husband. We used to talk about books and what books we've been reading. And, bearing in mind that this person was the same age as my grandma, we were discussing and swapping books because we liked this. I remember reading the Louis de Bernier series, which is set in South America, and it's all about magical realism. And we both really loved it. We were swapping these books between us, and yeah, just had a really kind of close relationship, and I kind of felt I can't think of the right word, a kinship with her. And was inspired by her, the fact that she didn't have children, she'd had this job, she'd had this kind of exciting life, probably until she got married, because that was what happened in those days. But I think she'd married a bit later anyway, and just there was a different way. And that for me, she'd gone to university, she'd studied, and that was, and like I say, it was only afterwards I felt I was more like her than some of the other people that I knew.
And what sort of age were you at this stage where you were
I think I was probably in my
this connection?
20s. Yeah,
Right.
I definitely around the time I was a student. But I think that was quite kind of, yeah. She just really sticks in my mind. She died a number of years ago, and yeah, it was very sad really, because just really she was just a great person, such a great conversationalist. Really used to love just spending time with her and her husband Mike. We just talk about everything, and in a way that you wouldn't expect to with your grandma, for instance, who she was the same age as. There was no judgment, and we just have really interesting conversations.
The way you're talking about her, it sounds as though he was a bit of a mentor for you before mentorship became the thing that
Yeah,
it is investigator, but that informal sense of somebody who's been there, has had some experiences that I can learn from.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. And I think she'd studied history, and I did history A level and did well in it, and she was very proud. It was that kind of,
mm,
yeah, just that kind of thing. And she came to my wedding, even though she was old and in a wheelchair, not well, she travelled the length of the country to come to my wedding.
wow. Wow. Oh, which means I must have met her, or at least been in
Yes.
the same space
Yeah,
as her, and never
exactly.
knew. There's
Yeah.
my first thing, or one of my first things that I didn't know. I've learned something already.
Yeah. Yeah. Amazing.
Um, so then moving on a few years, where did university and the decision to study, I'm assuming I think psychology, or am I really going to show myself up now?
No,
Yes,
it was.
psychology. Where did all of that come from? What phase of your life was that?
Yeah, so this is where you're going to see how I make a lot of my decisions. Really random. I don't
One
actually
of
know.
It's one of the many things I love about you is the randomness. A conversation with you just meanders everywhere. Brilliant.
Yeah, that's the story of my life. I don't actually know why I decided to study psychology. It wasn't really a thing at A level when so sort of in the late 80s. Um, I I just decided. I think I knew someone who'd done it and thought, oh, that sounds interesting. I think someone, the daughter of a place I was working, in a part-time job when I was at school. I think she'd studied psychology, and I thought, oh, that sounds interesting, having no clue what it was, or anything about it. I just kind of stumbled in it, and in truth, I didn't really enjoy it.
No? And
No,
yet here you are doing the work that you do.
I know. I think it's because it was very broad and it was very sciencey, very sort of lots of biology and things which were not the kind of thing. It wasn't what I thought it was going to be. And I think if I was to give any advice to anybody who was going to study psychology, I say look at the course really carefully and see what it contains, because they're all quite different, and they will be more or less aligned with what you think psychology is, depending on where you go to university. So I loved the things like, all the learnings, the stuff about learning, which was particularly prevalent in the sports. I did a sports psychology module, which was quite new at the time. It was a bit trendy. But there was a lot about learning there, which was really interesting. And I really loved, just from curiosity, all of the mental health stuff, which was, fascinating. Abnormal psychology, as it was known.
Abnormal psychology. Is that language? You think how that's changed
I
over the
know, I know.
abnormal psychology.
Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah. But I didn't, when I did it, I realized, I chose not to become a clinical psychologist because I thought that I would find it really difficult to not get too emotionally involved.
Mm-hmm.
I remember that as being a conscious choice, which is
Yeah.
ironic given that I'm now studying a therapy qualification. But yeah, I decided, and I looked at criminal psychology. They decided I was too scared to do that, because I was afraid.
Demanding in a different way, for
Yeah,
sure.
yeah. That was pre-Cracker. Do you remember Cracker?
I do remember Robbie
I
Coltrane,
used to
wasn't it?
love that. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. AKA Hagrid. Um,
You could have been you just like Hagrid, is
I
what you're
could have been
saying.
Hagrid. People are going to wonder what on earth we're talking about.
I know.
But yes, I was. So yeah, I chose to go and work at the health service as a business manager instead. Yeah.
Mhm. That's a really interesting decision. And around this time of life came quite a big move for you
Yes.
for a different part of
Yes.
the world.
Yes. Yes. So I'd been in the health service for a number of years. Can't remember how many. And I met someone, a man. And so another thing Jenny and I have in common is that we both lived in Canada. So I moved to Canada, so it would have been 1998. I think I moved to Canada. So I met someone, and moved over to Canada to Whistler Ski Resort to go and live there, and had an absolute blast.
I've heard so many of your stories about your time in Whistler. And I'm sure somehow that fed my desire to want to move to Canada someday, just in all of these stories. So just share a bit more. What was that like? What were you doing? How did that shape you?
Yeah, well, I think what the reason that I think it's part of my secret resume is it's probably not even something I would put on my resume because it was a 2 year period, but it was one of the most influential periods of my life. And I think for one, I very much veered off the expected path. So I'd been a graduate trainee in the health service. I had a proper job. Postgraduate training scheme, I was doing well. You know, the trajectory is one way, and I went whoop and went off and did something else. And
But even just that decision, going against the grain, going against the norm, what was that like doing that at that stage?
absolutely nothing to me. Like, I I've never really been that bothered about what other people think I should do. That's the truth. I've always just it just seemed like a good idea. And I thought, well, I was young, you know, I was in my 20s. I
And
can
in
always
love.
come back, and yeah, exactly. And it's like nothing's irreversible. That's my view. And you know, I didn't have a house, I didn't have children, I didn't have any pets, you know, I had no ties.
Mm,
So, I mean, it was a bit scary, but not particularly at all.
mm.
It was more exciting than anything else. You know, I was going to a different country and I couldn't even ski. I was moving to a ski resort.
How long did it take you to learn to ski
It was a quite painful process. I learned to ski and snowboard at the same time. Obviously, not
together?
literally at the same time. Yes, in the same time period, I learnt both. And then I went with snowboarding over skiing because actually I found that even though it was immensely painful starting because you fall over a lot and your stomach muscles kill from pulling yourself up. Once you get to a certain level, you can go anywhere on a snowboard, much more so than you can on skis. So I just kind of
Mhm.
stuck with snowboarding.
Mm. My husband is, as you know, Scott is a more of a snowboarder than a skier. I'm a skier. I tried snowboarding once, and what you say about your core muscles and the falling backwards. So the two of us together on a ski lift. It's his with his snowboard, I'm with my skis, trying to get off and not tip each other over. It's hilarious.
Yes. Well,
Um,
but all my family are skiers. So my brother and my dad in particular have always skied. And so,
mm.
yeah, the same. My dad was always great though, because if you ever got to a flat bit, he'd pull me along. It's really helpful on a
You
snowboard.
do. So
Um,
say a bit more about the people that you met in
yeah.
Canada, the experiences you had.
Well, it was quite a humbling experience as well because I'd gone from, you know, being a manager in the health service and, you know, having a significant number of people reporting to me and having a lot of responsibility to right back to the bottom. So
Mm,
I worked for a time in a hotel, which I hated with a passion, largely because it was full of really demanding, entitled people. The guests, not the staff. It was awful. I worked in an estate agent's for a while, which I quite enjoyed, although that was where I had my first and only experience of sexual harassment.
oh,
And but the people, I met some lovely people there, and I met genuinely, like, Canadians are just like so friendly and really, really liked. I lived not an expat lifestyle. My
mm,
boyfriend was Canadian. And
mm,
so I lived a Canadian lifestyle. I didn't hang around with, I think, only one other British person.
yeah,
So that gives you a very different experience, I
it does.
think.
Yeah.
But I eventually worked for most of the time for a guy called Hugh Smythe, who I told you about the other day. Danny's been looking him up.
I
So
did.
he's
I'd
like,
never heard of him.
but he's very famous.
Very
Yeah.
famous. Yeah.
Yeah, in that world, he's very famous. In the Canadian ski world, lots and lots of people would know him because he was one of the founders, really, of Whistler Blackcomb Ski Resort. He'd lived there a long time. He kind of helped build it up. He got Intrawest involved, who invested a lot of money and built a lot of real estate there. And he, at the time, was, I think he was like the director of operations for 10 of their ski resorts. So they had 10 ski resorts around North America.
This is at the time that
The time I was there.
Contacted, yeah.
Yeah, so that would have been right at the sort of 98, 99. And he was just such a great man, really humble, quite shy. But like I say, everybody knew him. And I was the assistant to the assistant. So he had an EA who was basically his left hand. I said his left hand woman waving my right hand. His left hand woman. And I was her assistant. So PA to them both, really. And like I say, humbling in many ways, having come from being the boss to being the PA.
And that takes courage, right? To go from that role that you were in, where you were hierarchically, you were in a position of power, to let that go and be humble enough to take something like that is a really big deal, and something that not a lot of people would do.
It probably bothered me more than I thought, and probably more financially than anything else. But it was really great in many ways. One, because it was good for me. It's good for your ego, I think, to do that. But also, I learned loads of new skills. So again, if you think about when this was, so it's just before the millennium, computers were starting to be much more integrated into work lives. And so I learned a lot of practical things like spreadsheets and PowerPoint and technical things that I didn't know previously. And he was also super, super interested in leadership, more than any other leader probably I've ever met since. And he was particularly interested in the theory of it. So he had loads of books, and he would get magazines like Fast Company magazine and Harvard Business Review and stuff like that. And I'd never come across these before. So I wasn't that busy because it wasn't that hard a job. And as you and I have discussed, the work-life balance is different in Canada anyway, and particularly when you're in a ski resort. So he would give me stuff to read and research and say, go and look up this, I want to know more about it. They were very forward thinking. They're the first person I've ever saw where they used, testing, psychometric testing, to allocate people to different roles, because they had mass recruitment once a year. They were really far ahead compared to 10 plus years later. People still weren't doing that when I came back to the UK. They called their HR department employee experience.
I think that's so telling, isn't it? What is the HR function called?
Yeah. So it was a really interesting place to work, to see how they treated people, how they empowered their employees. That was fascinating. But what it did was get me involved, and made me realise that what I'd really enjoyed of my previous roles was development of other people. So even though I was much younger than the people I was managing when I was in the NHS, I'd really enjoyed that opportunity to try and help people grow and develop. So that's what really kick-started me realising that that's what I really loved. But I've just have such a nice story about what an amazing man Hugh was. So this man, very important, was in a meeting with the guy who ran Whistler Blackcomb, so was in charge of the whole resort. They were having a meeting, and he came running out of the meeting to get me because there was a bear just outside the window, and he knew that I would love to see it. So he literally came and got me, interrupted his meeting so that I could see this bear that was on the hill outside the window.
Wow.
I mean,
That
it's
speaks
just,
volumes
it really
about the
does.
humanity, the human
Yes.
connection of someone
Yeah.
that senior in that sort of meeting
Yeah.
takes
And
the
he wouldn't have
time.
gone and got someone else. It was because it was me and I was
Yeah.
quite new to the
And he
area.
knew
And
that.
yeah,
He knew he'd
yeah,
taken the time to get to know you a little
yeah,
bit, to know that
yeah,
that would be important to you.
yeah. Just a very human man, very humble, like I say, quite shy in many ways, but yeah, such an inspiration.
Yeah. And you mentioned that he introduced you to things like Fast Company and Harvard Business Review. And you mentioned earlier about books and how important books had been.
Mm.
What else were you reading at that time, or inspired to take a look at, that kind of accelerated and inspired you?
Well, I think this was the time that I came across Joe Jaworski. I don't even know if I'm saying his name right. That's how I've always said it in my head. But he wrote a book called Synchronicity, The Inner Path of Leadership, I think is the full title. And I think this is where I first came across it. If not then, there was an article I read about him then. So it
Mm.
was definitely around this time. And a Synchronicity is one of my all-time favorite books.
Mm.
And it really, the reason I loved it is because it talks about leadership in such a deep and holistic way, that I completely, really, really loved it. But also, it talked about, there was an article where it talked about the retreats, leadership retreats
Mm.
that he did with others, and where they took people away quite often into the wilderness, and really took a very different approach to developing leaders and helping leaders really look into themselves but also connect with each other. And he now is very much involved in the dialogue movement. Well, he always was, actually, because
Yeah.
that's where he'd kind of done a lot of work, mediation, dialogue type work. So he's always been a huge inspiration for me, and that was where I think that I first came across him, was because of you, really.
And that, I also read that book. It may even have been you who recommended me to read
Probably.
it, actually.
I've recommended it to many people.
And it's a story of his transformation, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Was he a lawyer? He was a lawyer.
Yeah, maybe, but very much in the corporate world. He worked at Shell, I think, didn't he? It was him.
I think he did. The thing I remember is a very left-brained, logical, common sense, and then his personal transformation to totally change how he saw the world.
Yeah, yeah. And I just think that, we need more of that kind of leader, and that's really what I want to do, is help. It really inspired me, this sense of wanting to make workplaces better places. It really reinforced that all of the stuff that I've been learning, and it's absolutely true now as much as it was then. It's the workplace I want to make a difference.
Yeah.
And I know that you can make a difference on a very small, what feels like a very small scale, but it's a much larger scale. And it's a slightly cliched story. You probably know it. I have no idea where I heard it from. It may well have been Peter Bluckett who did our coach training. Who knows? But there's a story of a man, and there's lots of starfish have. That she's smiling. She knows the story.
My daughter was given this story at a theatrical production that she was a part of, and one of the leads gave this story, and I read it, and I thought, I love this story.
Yeah,
that useful story.
Yeah. So it's lots of starfish have washed up on the beach, and there's a man walking along the beach, and he's picking up the starfish one by one, and he's throwing them back into the water. And there's thousands of them, and someone comes up to him and says, well, why are you doing that? You can't possibly get all of these starfish back into the sea. And he says, no, but I'm making a difference to that one, and that one, and that one. And I heard that story a really long time ago, and that to me is how I feel about my career, is that if I can just have an impact on one person, that's great for them. But what I also know is there's a ripple effect, and particularly
Yes.
if we're working with leaders, or the new book is about teams. So,
Mm.
looking at a sort of small cluster of people, a small cluster of starfish, um, then you can have really quite a profound impact because we spend so much time at work.
We do. And you mentioned ripples. What I find fascinating, I've personally experienced this, and I've worked with other leaders who also have experienced this. Sometimes you don't know the ripples.
Mm,
You just don't know how you've made a difference to that one person.
no.
Who have they then gone on and been different with and shown up with in a
Mm,
different way? And then the ripples expand and
hmm.
expand, and you never know how
No,
far it's gone.
no. And even people you work with, I was really touched when I had my leaving do when I left Corn Ferry. When would that have been? About 18 months ago. And, such a range of people came. But what was lovely is how people came up to me and said really nice things to me about how I'd had an impact on them that I would never, ever have known. And it's really touching when you hear that. That was as me as a leader, as a person, rather than as a coach or facilitator, in a sort of personal context as a colleague. But yeah, you just don't know. You kind of have to trust that you are.
Yeah. Doesn't surprise me one bit that many people came to say that to you. So let's go back. So we're in Canada, and at some point you do come back to the UK. So what sparked that, and what happened next?
Yeah, I mean, the relationship broke down. I could have stayed in Canada. I did have a visa that would have allowed me to stay in Canada. But I think there were two things. One was actually taking that step down, and it was a big step down, made me realize how important my work was to me
Mm,
and how important it was going to be to make that difference.
yeah.
And I wouldn't have been able to do that in the role that I was in. And it was a bit dead men's shoes in somewhere like that because it's such a great place to live that no
Yeah.
one moves on, and
No.
so it's really hard to get a decent job. And it would have probably been years till I was able to get anywhere near back to where I had been previously. So there was partly that, as I say, the relationship had broken down, but also my sister had had children. And I really wanted to be back with my family. I
Mm,
wanted to see my nephews grow up, and be involved with them.
yeah.
And yeah, I missed my family, so I came
Mm.
home.
You come home, and then where do you find yourself
I
next?
did a master's. So, having hated psychology,
I was just thinking this. So you hated it, you did it for 3 years, and then you did a master's, and then.
yeah, so I hated psychology, but in the intervening period, so we're talking, I graduated in 92 and I came back to the UK from Canada in 2000. And I did a master's then because in that time, occupational psychology had become much more prevalent, and it wasn't
Mm,
when I did my degree. So, almost 10 years later, it was that's what I came back and did. So I did a
yeah.
master's in occupational psychology at UMIST, which doesn't exist anymore, in Manchester.
Mm,
It's now part of the University of Manchester. And that's where I really got to indulge and wallow in, things like assessment and selection, leadership development, just all the things team development, I had some great
mm,
tutors. Kerry Cooper was one of my tutors, very well known occupational psychologist, and Mike Smith, who also well known. He's always
yeah.
quoted around assessment and selection research.
Yeah.
Ivan Robertson, also well known. Lots of good researchers were at Manchester, and good lecturers. So that really then kind of led me, again accidentally because I don't plan anything, into a consulting career. I just
Mhm.
kind of realised that that's what lots of people who did a master's in occupational psychology did. So
Mm,
I went to I went to work for OPP, which is where you and I met,
It
in
is.
Oxford. It's
Yeah.
now called the Myers-Briggs Company. We
Mm.
spent many happy hour training people in MBTI, but also we did lots of development centres, didn't we? They were my favourite things when we
Yeah.
used to travel and go and do the development centres.
Yeah. Yeah. It was a great team. So many happy memories. Long out where you and I spoke about this the other day about running assessment centres and still being there in the wash up at midnight. But also many happy times and learning. That's the thing I remember about that
Mm,
phase of my career is just being surrounded by people with the same specialism and learning so
mm.
much.
The thing I really sticks out for me as well is the depth of experience that we got because it was quite a narrow range of things that the company did. You did a
Mm,
lot of the same thing, and when I really noticed when I went to Hay Group afterwards how people would do something once or twice and get bored and go off and not want to do it anymore. And I
mm,
think you just don't build up your skills in the same way then. So I
mm.
think that was one real advantage is that we really, and it was very best practice as well. So you really got schooled
Really,
in
the
in
standards were
that.
so high.
Yeah, yeah, in a way that I've not necessarily seen elsewhere.
Mm,
And it was one thing that I had to let go of, and I'm sure you've had the same experience. When you work somewhere where people's expectations around best practice are not as high and they're more in the real world, you kind of have to let go of some of that sticking too tightly, else A, no one would ever buy from you, and B, you just end up fighting all the time, I think.
yeah. Yeah. The word pragmatism is
Yes.
one that I've learnt since my OPP
Mm,
um, years is okay, so that's the best practice. Now, pragmatically, how does that work in a real system that you are
mm,
now a part of or you're
mm.
intervening? Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's what was interesting about. So I was there for 5 years and then moved to Hay Group. Um,
And that's
and it,
quite a change in terms of size, right? Because
yes.
OPP, I think when we started there was about 80 people,
Yeah.
all based in the same location. And then
Yeah.
you go to Hay.
Hay Group was not as big as many people think. It was maybe about 3,500, but all over
Mm.
the globe. We were in
Yeah.
50 countries, I think. Um, and that was brilliant from, again, from a learning, very different kind of learning. So
Mm.
both the global perspective, but then also the breadth of what the organisation did.
Mm.
And again, like you say, that pragmatism, so many people to learn from, people who'd been, I was working with people who were in their 80s who'd been doing this
Mm.
forever. And yeah, just the global learning was incredible, like
Yeah.
realizing that you can't just apply things around the world and expect them to land.
Mm.
So many great clients. Yeah, just a
Mm.
really, really good place to work.
And you stay with Hay for
Yeah,
some time,
yeah.
which then ultimately becomes Corn
Corn
Ferry.
Ferry, yes.
Yeah.
But just prior to that, so it was whilst we were still Hay Group, I so in that time I'd got married, had a child, and became a single parent.
Mm.
And I made a sideways move. So again, it was this kind of going off the obvious trajectory, because I didn't think that I could be a consultant and a single parent. The amount of travel I was doing, the
Mm.
expectation of super long days just didn't seem compatible. So I made a sideways move into the products department. At the
And so
time, it was
you
called
were
Productized Services, which is a terrible name.
productized. Is that even a word? Productized?
American word, I think. I don't know. It's maybe just made up.
So previously so in Hay you were doing a consultant role,
Hmm.
you were suitcase in hand, going wherever you needed to go.
Yeah,
Then this move to this other part of
yeah,
the organization. So again, quite a bold move because consultancy, certainly the organizations I've been aware of, is always seen as kind of the sexy fun thing, the
yes,
glamorous thing. So to step away from
yeah.
that, how how was that perceived by people around you? And
People thought I was mad.
yeah,
People actually said, "What are you doing?" why are you doing that? Yeah, they genuinely thought I was crazy.
I thought it would be
Because it
career
was not the
limiting.
sexy bit. You know, the products department had historically been the support to the consulting
Mm,
department. That's what they existed for, was to provide diagnostics and products to the consultancy.
mm,
About a year or so before I moved over, they'd actually gone direct to market. So they were selling the products
mm,
direct to clients, which is
mm,
why this role even came about, because they were looking for people who had leadership experience, assessment experience, and diagnostic experience.
mm.
And of course, from coming from OPP, I had all of those
Yeah,
things. So that's how I ended up in that role, and I loved it. I
yeah,
really loved it. The people were so nice. They were such a great department. And we were literally on the same floor. I was, no
yeah.
distance at all away from where I had previously been based. But the people were lovely. They were so welcoming. And yeah, they were just, I learned a lot about diagnostics and the technicalities
Mm,
of them, and how, particularly when you work for a big company where they've been around a while, that it's not easy to change things and personalize things.
mm.
But also, I learned a lot about marketing
Yeah.
because they were direct to market. They had their own marketing department, and I worked closely with them and did quite a lot of work. And it's really when I first started, speaking at conferences, doing PR.
Mm.
And that was really, I would never have had that opportunity in the consultancy at the level I was at.
And you said that initially that move was it was a practical decision for
Hmm.
you to have some kind of balance as a single parent. But it sounds like, whether intentional or not, it actually brought you so much more than a practical way to have a career and be
Yeah,
mum.
absolutely. And I think that's, I'm a huge fan. I've read about this, and I guess I kind of realized that I was living it, that having a breadth of experience is really, really important, and that
Mm,
you can shoot up very quickly up a career trajectory, but you lack experience and
yeah.
you've missed that certain things out. And so my route was much more winding, but once I ended up back in consultancy, I which I had to go back in, really, because I was kind of moved there as we got acquired and things were all being moved around, which I was very concerned about.
Mm,
What happened was I then got promoted really quite quickly up into a senior client partner role, because I had all that marketing experience, and I'd had lots more business development experience, and I had a broader understanding and a broader network
mm,
across the business, and those things were all important.
mm. And how did your experience of being a single mum, being a successful professional, how did your own lived experience kind of shape some of the work that you then begin to do in the DE&I space?
Yeah, it really did. I think that's what really brought me to the D&I world,
Mm,
was an experience of being a single parent and a senior client partner in a global firm is not that common.
mm,
In fact, I remember when it was quite a typical partner process, where you had I think, sort of case manager, and they interviewed lots of people, and then they put forward a case. So you had to kind of be nominated for that process. And this was my
mm,
senior client partner process. They do it for both associate client partner and senior client partner. And I remember him saying to me something about me being a single parent, and that he wouldn't mention it as
mm.
part of the
Mm.
process. And I was like, oh, why not? It was really interesting that his perception was I was going to get judged on it. Whereas
And
actually, I
judged
think
negatively.
yes, I think it's the opposite. I
Me too.
think that
Yeah.
that people were respectful of the fact that I could do both, and that I was still successful, and I was hitting all my targets and beating them, and yeah, I think it was the opposite was true. People liked the fact. And actually, I know colleagues did, and colleagues said it to me when I got promoted. I got quite a lot of emails from people saying, you know, I'm so happy to see that you can be a single parent and still achieve and be recognised in the organisation. But it was just really interesting that he had had the opposite perception. Yeah. So, and what did change though in when I went back into consulting is I took a more business development role.
Yeah.
So I did less client delivery because that gave me more control.
Yeah.
Because I couldn't have travelled all around.
And another string to your bow then. So business development set, which amazing experience for what you find yourself doing today. But at the time, how was that transition to a BD role?
Well, I'd started doing more of it in, I'd always done some because we had to, but I'd started doing more of it in the product department. So then when I went back into consulting, I think what was interesting is that partly it's a self-image thing, isn't it? Because I didn't see myself as a business developer. And I'd probably said that to people, and then that's the judgment they have of you.
Of course, yeah.
And then when I go around selling quite big things, people are surprised because they're like, oh, I didn't think that you were that person. I thought you were the fluffy L&D hippie person. And, you know, people's perception of me changed. And I think changing companies probably helped with that as well, because then you've got a whole new bunch of colleagues who don't have that previous perception of you.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's and very useful now, as you say.
Yes. So you're with Corn Ferry for some time. You've
Yes.
got that breadth, and then where does the inspiration for doing your own thing come from?
Well, I think I'd been there 16 years in Hay Group and Corn Ferry together, which is a long time.
It's a long time. I don't
Yeah,
think I clocked it was quite that long.
yeah,
Wow.
yeah. So 2006 to 2022. And I just felt like it was time. Funnily enough, when I'd started consulting, I always thought I'd work for myself. It just took me 16 years, no more, 20 odd years to get there. Partly because as a single parent, it's a big risk. That did feel like a risk. I'm the sole breadwinner. You know, I do get money from Holly's dad that contributes, but, you know, I am the breadwinner in my house, and I have a 14-year-old child who everybody knows how expensive teenage girls are. That did feel like a risk, but I'd earned enough that I felt that it wasn't too much of a risk, and that I was, you know, in a decent enough place for it to not feel like that. And I just felt ready. I had started doing the therapy course that I mentioned, so Being Me Therapy. I was a year or so into that, and yeah, just felt like now was the time to do it for myself. So yeah, that was 18 months ago. Well, yeah, just under. It's about 16 months ago, something like that. Yeah.
So the Being Me therapy course sounds like it took where you'd gotten to from previous development, thinking about the coaching program we did, and it sounds like it's gone even deeper and it's been even more transformational for you.
Yeah. So it has definitely some. So the coaching course we did, the guy who taught us was a Gestalt psychotherapist, or had been, hadn't he? So that was very much informed the style of coaching that he taught us. But what this has done is taken it to a whole other level, both from a personal perspective of realizing some things about myself that I didn't realize before, predominantly around what I thought were core elements of me actually being learned behaviors. And was quite a revelation, and a bit of a, if I'm not that, then who the hell am I? A few of those moments, but also just the skills that I'm learning, and the ability to go deeper with clients, which is why I wanted to do it. I don't want to be a therapist. I want to integrate it into my business work, and I think there's plenty of people out there who want to and need to go a bit deeper.
Well, the world kind of relies on it, doesn't it, right now, the quality of leadership, big and small.
Yeah. And I
And
think
going,
I was just going to say, I think we've all got things that hold us back, and have always held us back, and we don't really tackle them. And so that's what I'm really keen to work with people on, are those really kind of tricky things that are just getting in the way of us really, really meeting our full potential.
and you touched much earlier in your story about the sense of responsibility that you felt in that early part of your life. Is that something that you've been exploring through this program?
Yes, letting go of that. So letting go of the sense of responsibility for others, letting go of not articulating my needs, and actually knowing what they are, saying no to people, which has always been hard at work, saying no to people. But yeah, saying no, that's really been freeing. Hence the name of the company, Liberare, which means to free in Italian. And it's in Italian because much of the studying that I do for Being Me is in Italy. So I kind of was attracted to the idea of having an Italian name. Although, of course, no one can say the name of my company properly. So
well, even I asked you the other day, I've written it phonetically, Liberare. So you've been running your own practice now for over a year. And I know you're having a great time because we've spoken about it. What are you learning?
Everything. I'm learning so much. I've read so many books, and I'm addicted to podcasts. So I'm learning a lot of stuff technically. There's so much. The world is constantly changing, and new theories coming out all of the time. So I've learned a lot from a technical perspective. I'm really enjoying the creative freedom. When you work for a big company, you're always restricted in some ways, and you've got to involve lots of different people, and it's just more challenging. Whereas you do it for yourself, because I've got more time, my brain is freer. So it's not just having the freedom; it's actually I have. It made me think of the what's it called with Alan Sugar? I can't remember the name of it.
The Apprentice?
Apprentice. And there was a guy in The Apprentice years and years ago. He's sadly died since, a young guy. And he said, which just made me laugh so much, I'm not just a one-trick pony. I'm a whole field of ponies running towards you. He meant it seriously. I think it's hilarious, but that's kind of how it feels. I've got like a whole field of ponies in my head running around of ideas, and that's why I wrote the book, because these ideas were forming into this idea of how D&I shouldn't be separate. So how, a team model or an inclusive team model should also be a high performing team model. And that's really where it came from, is this bringing together of my different worlds, I suppose, into a model.
Having got the chance to read some of your chapters before you publish, that's one of the things I love about the way you've written it, is it's so integrated rather than seeing it as something separate with a separate strategy, which I've actually never seen that really have impact. Where I've seen it have impact is exactly what you talk about. And that alignment with how do you build this into the everyday experience rather than a thing that somebody has to do.
Yes.
I found quite unusual in the way that you've written.
Yeah, and that's really my whole thinking around DEI, is that it shouldn't be separate. And actually, we're trying to make it too separate a thing. It puts barriers up. But if we really want it to be part of our everyday existence, we have to design it into our everyday existence. So yeah, the book was actually a real joy to write, because there was all these ideas, floating around, and it was a chance to both, I'd gathered them into the model, but it also helped me improve the model from doing all of the research and gathering it all together. So yeah, it was surprisingly easy to write. And yeah, I'm already thinking about my next book because I've got an idea for that too.
Are you ready to share a little bit with the world what that is?
No, I will just say that it will be a book about leadership.
A book about leadership.
Yeah.
So what else is next for you?
Well, the book launch is January 17th. And which I think probably will be the day I put this podcast out.
Oh,
And then a party after that. So, kind of at the moment, what's really on my mind is getting this out into the world. I've built a diagnostic that goes alongside it, which is really for professionals to use. So, any professional, a D&I professional, L&D team, development professionals, speak to me because they will I'm doing some online learning and access to the diagnostic, which will allow them to really work at a much deeper level with teams. And in my dream, what will happen is organizations will have lots of teams doing this, and so you kind of create a movement. That's how I would love to see it happening. And what I'm really passionate about as a consultant, which is perhaps slightly unusual. So I don't think it should be about me. I don't think it should be limited by me, and I don't think I should gatekeep my ideas. I want my ideas to be out there. So I want people to be using them. So I want organizations to be using them for themselves. I want the teams to be using this for themselves. The book is written so that any team member, any team leader could pick it up. Sorry, I can hear my dog scratching under the table. Can pick it up and use it, and I want it to be out there. I don't want to be me being the bottleneck for any of this. So that's kind of where I am. I want this to be out there. I want to create a movement. I want people to think differently about how to create an inclusive culture in their organization, and not just think about the leaders or individuals, unconscious bias, conscious inclusion. I want them to think that actually all the work that we do happens at a team level. So let's think about the team collectively taking responsibility.
In the way that you describe that, Mel, is one of the many things I love about you is just living life based on the notion of abundance rather than scarcity. I must keep the thing that is mine, and instead you open, here it is, please take it, please bring it to life in your organization in a way that works for you. And you can do it. You don't need me to be there to do it.
Yeah. And I think that partly comes from having worked for big consultancies where it's a little bit more, everything's a bit more gate kept. I want it to be, I want people to be more self-sufficient. That's what I believe will really help organizations, is self-sufficiency, not just relying on consultants.
It's the health of the system that way, isn't it? You're creating healthy autonomy rather than unhealthy dependence. So you mentioned the book. Did you say the title of the book? Just say again what the title of the current book is.
It's called The Inclusive Team.
The Inclusive Team. And where and when can people get hold of it?
So 17th of January, it's available. It'll be available on Amazon as a Kindle and as a paperback and as a hardback, actually. And yeah, or actually people should be able to go into their local bookshop and say, I'd like to order a copy. It won't be on the shelves, but you can go that way and order. And it'll be available on all the Amazons, not just UK.
But Amazon Canada?
It will be on Amazon Canada, yes. So yeah, it's very exciting and slightly nerve-wracking as well.
Do you have a copy yet? Have you had that moment of having it?
Yes, I should have it. Yes, I have a copy. Yes, there is one copy in existence in the world, and I have it.
Well, there'll be many, many more in the months to come.
I hope so. I hope so.
The time has flown in this. It has for me, anyways. Time has just flown in this conversation. And I know in your podcast, when you interview people, you always ask a couple of questions to close. So I'm not going to let you off the hook. So first, I love hearing the answers that your guests give. I absolutely love it and go, ah. So the first question is your secret resume. What's the headline or the strap line that you would give it?
It is not all wander, say it again, not all who wander are lost.
Not all who wander are lost.
Or
Beautiful.
wonder.
Mel and I joked, so there's a play on words because wander can be wander, as in wandering around, and wander can be thinking, wandering. Works on many levels.
It does.
And you mentioned Joseph Jaworski, Synchronicity. What are the other books that have inspired you that you would recommend to us all?
Ooh, there's loads. Another one that was really influential for me was Changing for Good by, I always choose people with difficult names. James Prochaska, I think is how you pronounce it. Quite an old book, but really good around how people change. And introduced me to the idea of pre-contemplation, where people are not even ready to talk about or think about things. I would say anything by Irving D. Yalom, very well-known therapist, brilliant writer. Anything by him I would read. And I'm listening to an audiobook which is called The Mindful Body at the moment, which is by Ellen J. Langer. She is a psychologist, and she talks about the mind, not the mind-body connection, it's the mind-body integration. So the relationship between our mind and our health, which is really fascinating.
Wow, some
There you go,
fabulous recommendations there. Yeah.
Broke my own rules.
And then my last question for you, what advice would you give to your younger self?
I would say you can say no.
You can say no. I am imagining that is going to resonate with a lot of people listening to this interview, this conversation.
Yeah.
So Melody, thank you so much again for asking me to do this. I have just loved this conversation so much, and I have learned a few new things about you. So it just goes to show when you really spend time listening to someone else's story, what comes up. So thank you.
And thank you, Jenny. I have loved this. I think I'm probably going to lose my job now, and people will be requesting you do interviews on the podcast. But no, really, really enjoyed it. It's been fantastic having a taste of my own medicine. So thank you very much. This podcast is brought to you by Liberare Consulting, with editing provided by Hawkins Social. If you enjoyed today's episode, why not click on the subscribe button so you are the first to hear about new episodes. We look forward to welcoming you back soon.